Maria Santos stood barely 5 feet 2 inches tall in her combat boots, her frame so slight that the standard-issue military uniform seemed to swallow her whole. At 19 years old, she weighed just 110 pounds soaking wet, a fact that her drill instructors never let her forget during the grueling months of basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. "Santos, you look like a strong wind could blow you to the next county," Sergeant Thompson bellowed as Maria struggled to complete her 100th push-up of the morning. Her arms trembled with exhaustion, but she refused to quit. The other recruits had finished their sets minutes ago and were already moving on to the next exercise, but Maria continued grinding out repetitions with determination written across her face. Growing up in a small town in Texas, Maria had always been the smallest kid in her class. Her parents, both immigrants who worked double shifts to make ends meet, had initially been horrified when she announced her intention to join the military. Her mother, Elena, had cried for 3 days straight when Maria first brought home the recruitment papers. "Mija, you are too small, too delicate for this life," her mother had pleaded, holding Maria's tiny hands in her own work-worn ones. "The military is for big, strong men, not for girls like you." But Maria had made up her mind. She had watched her parents struggle financially her entire life, working themselves to the bone just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. The military offered her a chance at education, healthcare, and a steady income that could help support her family. More importantly, it offered her a chance to prove that size didn't determine strength or courage. The decision hadn't come easily. Throughout high school, Maria had excelled academically, earning a 3.8 GPA despite working part-time jobs to help her family. Her guidance counselor had encouraged her to apply for college scholarships, pointing out her strong grades in mathematics and science. But scholarship money was limited, and even with financial aid, the cost of higher education seemed insurmountable for her family. The military recruiter who visited her high school that spring had painted an attractive picture: education benefits, job training, the opportunity to serve her country, and immediate income that could help her family. For Maria, who had always felt the weight of her family's financial struggles, it seemed like the perfect solution. But basic training proved to be more challenging than she had ever imagined. From day one, her physical limitations became glaringly obvious. While her male counterparts easily hefted their 60-pound rucksacks during training marches, Maria struggled under the weight. The standard military equipment seemed designed for soldiers twice her size. "Santos, you're holding up the entire platoon again," Sergeant Williams would shout as Maria lagged behind during road marches. Her shorter legs meant she had to take nearly 2 steps for every one of her fellow soldiers, and the oversized gear threw off her balance with every movement. The rifle qualification course proved especially humbling. The M16 rifle, weighing over 7 pounds when fully loaded, felt unwieldy in her small hands. During her first attempt at marksmanship training, she could barely hold the weapon steady enough to aim properly. The recoil from each shot sent shockwaves through her slight frame, and by the end of the day, her shoulder was bruised purple from the stock of the rifle. "Maybe you should consider a different career path, Santos," suggested Sergeant Davis after Maria failed her first rifle qualification test. "There's no shame in admitting when something isn't a good fit. The military needs people in support roles too: clerks, cooks, supply specialists. Combat positions require a certain physical standard." The words stung more than Maria cared to admit. She had enlisted with dreams of serving in a combat role, of proving that she could contribute meaningfully to her unit's mission. The suggestion that she should settle for a support role felt like confirmation of every doubt that had been planted in her mind since she first walked through the gates of Fort Benning. But giving up wasn't in Maria's nature. That night, while her fellow recruits slept, she snuck out to the training facility and practiced with her rifle. She worked on her stance, her breathing, her trigger control. She studied the manual until she could recite the technical specifications from memory. She practiced dry-firing exercises until her fingers cramped. Her bunkmate, Jennifer Collins, a tall, athletic woman from Minnesota who had played college basketball before enlisting, noticed Maria's late-night training sessions. "You know you're going to burn yourself out if you keep this up," Jennifer warned one evening as Maria returned from another solo practice session. "You've been out there every night for 2 weeks." "I have to," Maria replied simply, sitting on the edge of her narrow bunk. Everyone thinks I'm too weak for this. Maybe they're right, but I'm not going to quit without giving everything I have. Jennifer studied her smaller bunkmate with newfound respect. She had initially dismissed Maria as another recruit who wouldn't make it through training, but she was beginning to see the steel beneath the diminutive exterior. You know what your problem is? Jennifer said after a long pause. You're trying to be strong the same way the big guys are strong. But you're not built like them, so you need to find your own way. The advice resonated with Maria in ways she hadn't expected. She began to study how she could leverage her smaller size and lower center of gravity to her advantage. She worked on technique rather than brute force, precision rather than power. Slowly, gradually, her performance began to improve. The breakthrough came during a combat simulation exercise in week 8 of basic training. The scenario involved navigating through a mock urban environment while under simulated enemy fire. Most of the larger recruits attempted to power through the course, using their size and strength to overcome obstacles. Maria took a different approach. Her small stature allowed her to move through spaces that others couldn't navigate. She found cover where others couldn't fit. Her light weight meant she could move quickly and quietly when stealth was required. For the first time since arriving at Fort Benning, her size became an advantage rather than a liability. Outstanding work, Santos, Sergeant Thompson acknowledged after the exercise. It was the first praise Maria had received from any of her instructors, and the words felt like validation of months of struggle and determination. But the real test was still ahead. Advanced individual training would determine whether Maria would be assigned to a combat role or shuffled into a support position. The next phase of training would be even more demanding, with longer road marches, heavier equipment loads, and more complex tactical scenarios. As basic training drew to a close, Maria reflected on how much she had changed over the past several months. She was stronger now, both physically and mentally, but more importantly, she had learned to work with her natural attributes rather than against them. The girl who had arrived at Fort Benning feeling overwhelmed by the standard equipment had evolved into a soldier who understood how to maximize her unique capabilities. Her family visited during graduation week, traveling from Texas to watch their daughter complete basic training. Maria's mother cried again, but this time the tears were of pride rather than worry. You did it, Mija, Elena whispered as she hugged her daughter after the ceremony. You proved them all wrong. But Maria knew the real challenge was just beginning. Advanced individual training would test everything she had learned and push her capabilities even further. The question wasn't whether she had proven herself during basic training. It was whether she could continue to excel when the standards became even higher. Standing in formation with her fellow graduates, Maria felt a mixture of pride and anticipation. She had survived the initial crucible, but she understood that her journey was far from over. The instructors who had initially doubted her capabilities were beginning to take notice, but she would need to continue exceeding expectations if she wanted to earn a place in a combat unit. The next phase would separate those who had simply survived basic training from those who had the potential to excel in actual military operations. For Maria, it represented another opportunity to prove that courage and determination could overcome physical limitations. As the graduation ceremony concluded and the new soldiers prepared to move on to their specialized training, Maria made a silent promise to herself. She would continue pushing her limits, continue proving her worth, and never allow anyone to define her capabilities based solely on her size. The journey that had begun with her parents' tears and her instructors' doubts was evolving into something more significant. Maria Santos was discovering that true strength came not from physical size, but from an unwillingness to accept limitations that others tried to impose. Advanced individual training at Fort Bragg brought new challenges that made basic training seem like a warm-up exercise. Maria found herself assigned to the Military Occupational Specialty Training for Combat Medics, a demanding program that combined advanced medical training with combat readiness requirements. The selection hadn't been her first choice, but her high scores in science and mathematics during basic training had made her an ideal candidate. The training was brutal from day one. Combat medics were expected to maintain all the physical standards of infantry soldiers while also mastering complex medical procedures. They needed to be able to carry wounded soldiers to safety, provide emergency medical care under fire, and maintain their own combat effectiveness throughout extended operations. A combat medic is only as good as their weakest moment, instructed Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the lead trainer for the program. When soldiers are dying and bullets are flying, nobody cares how small you are or what excuses you might have. They care whether you can save their life and get them home. The medical training itself came naturally to Maria. Her attention to detail and analytical mind made her excel at learning anatomy, emergency procedures, and pharmaceutical applications. She could memorize drug dosages, understand complex physiological processes, and perform medical procedures with steady hands even under simulated combat stress. But the physical demands remained her greatest challenge. Combat medics were required to carry standard equipment loads plus additional medical supplies, bringing their total gear weight to nearly 80 pounds. For Maria's slight frame, this represented more than 70% of her body weight. The first major test came during a simulated casualty evacuation exercise. The scenario involved moving through hostile terrain to reach wounded soldiers, providing emergency medical care, and then evacuating the casualties to a safe extraction point. The exercise was designed to test both medical skills and physical endurance under combat conditions. Maria's team consisted of 6 trainees, including herself, and 5 male soldiers who outweighed her by at least 50 pounds each. When they reached the simulated casualty site, they found 2 wounded soldiers, actually instructors wearing special effects makeup to simulate realistic injuries. "Santos, you take the chest wound," ordered team leader Peterson, a former college football player from Ohio who seemed to view Maria as the weak link in their group. "The rest of us will handle the evacuation." Maria quickly assessed her patient, who was simulating a penetrating chest wound with breathing difficulties. She established an airway, applied pressure dressings, and started in 4-line while the simulated enemy fire continued around them. Her medical skills were flawless, but she could see Peterson and the others exchanging glances as they prepared for the evacuation phase. "Santos, you stay here and provide security," Peterson decided as they prepared to move the casualties. "We'll handle carrying the wounded." The instruction felt like a slap in the face. Maria understood the implication. They didn't trust her to carry her share of the load during the evacuation. She was being relegated to a secondary role while the real soldiers handled the heavy work. But as the team attempted to carry both casualties simultaneously, their plan quickly fell apart. The terrain was more difficult than they had anticipated, with steep inclines and rocky ground that made carrying the wounded soldiers extremely challenging. Peterson's team struggled with coordination, frequently having to stop and rest as they tried to manage both patients. "This isn't working," gasped Private Williams, one of the stretcher carriers, after they had barely covered 100 meters. "We're not going to make the extraction point in time." Maria watched the situation deteriorating with growing frustration. She could see the solution clearly, but Peterson was too proud to ask for her help. Finally, she made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. "Let me take point position on the rear casualty," she called out, moving toward the struggling team. "I can navigate terrain better than trying to carry from the side." Peterson initially protested, but as their time limit approached and the team continued to struggle, he reluctantly agreed to let Maria take a position carrying the wounded soldier's legs while he managed the head and torso. What happened next surprised everyone, including Maria herself. Her low center of gravity and experience navigating difficult terrain during her childhood in the Texas Hill Country made her naturally adept at moving across uneven ground. Rather than being dead weight on the team, she became their stabilizing force. "Santos, how are you making this look easy?" panted Peterson as they successfully navigated a particularly challenging section of rocky terrain. Maria didn't have a good answer. She had never thought of herself as naturally athletic, but something about carrying wounded soldiers felt right to her. Her body seemed to understand how to distribute weight efficiently, how to find stable footing on uncertain ground, and how to coordinate with her teammates to maintain smooth movement. They completed the exercise with time to spare, earning commendation from their instructors. More importantly, Maria had proven to herself and her teammates that she could contribute meaningfully to the mission despite her physical limitations. "I owe you an apology," Peterson admitted afterward as they cleaned their equipment. I assumed you couldn't pull your weight, but you probably saved us from failing that exercise. The acknowledgement meant more to Maria than Peterson could have understood. For the first time since enlisting, she felt like she was being judged on her performance rather than her appearance. But success in training exercises didn't translate to universal acceptance among her peers. Many of the other trainees continued to view her with skepticism, questioning whether she would be able to perform in actual combat situations. The doubts were often expressed in subtle ways, being passed over for leadership roles during exercises, exclusion from informal training groups, and constant questioning of her decisions during tactical scenarios. The situation came to a head during a night training exercise that simulated a mass casualty event. The scenario involved multiple wounded soldiers scattered across a wide area, with teams required to locate, treat, and evacuate all casualties within a strict time limit. Maria found herself assigned to a team led by Sergeant Harris, a veteran instructor who had served multiple combat deployments in Afghanistan. Harris was known for his no-nonsense approach and his belief that training should replicate the stress and confusion of actual combat as closely as possible. Listen up, Harris briefed the team before the exercise began. Tonight you're going to find out what it really means to be a combat medic. The casualties are scattered across 3 kilometers of difficult terrain. You'll be working in the dark, under simulated enemy fire, with limited communication. Some of you are going to discover that this job isn't for you. The exercise began badly for Maria's team. Their first casualty was located at the bottom of a steep ravine, requiring a dangerous descent in complete darkness. The simulated patient had multiple traumatic injuries and required immediate surgical intervention to prevent bleeding out. While Maria worked to stabilize the patient, her teammates struggled to establish a secure perimeter and prepare for evacuation. The terrain made it nearly impossible to bring a stretcher down to the casualty location, and climbing back up while carrying a wounded soldier seemed almost impossible. "We need to call for helicopter extraction," suggested Private Morrison, one of Maria's teammates. "There's no way we can carry him up that slope." "Negative," Harris responded over the radio. "No air assets available. You need to find another solution." Maria studied the terrain while continuing to work on her patient. The ravine had a gentler slope about 200 meters to the east, but reaching it would require carrying the casualty through dense undergrowth and across unstable ground. It would be a difficult movement, but it was their only option. "I can carry him," Maria announced, surprising her teammates. Morrison laughed despite the seriousness of the situation. "Santos, that guy weighs at least 180. You can't carry him that distance." "I can do it," Maria insisted. "But I need one of you to spot me and handle navigation while I focus on the carry." The team exchanged skeptical glances, but they had no alternative plan. Harris observed silently as Maria positioned herself to lift the simulated casualty, a role typically played by the largest soldiers available. What Maria lacked in raw strength, she compensated for with technique and determination. She had studied body mechanics during her medical training and understood how to position her body to maximize leverage and minimize strain. More importantly, she had developed an intuitive understanding of how to move efficiently across difficult terrain. The carry that followed became legendary among the training cadre. Maria navigated the treacherous route with steady determination, never losing her footing despite carrying a soldier who weighed significantly more than she did. Her teammates provided security and navigation support, but the primary burden fell on her slight shoulders. "Santos, you need to rest," Morrison called out after they had covered half the distance. He could see the strain on Maria's face and was concerned about her ability to continue. "I'm fine," Maria gasped between labored breaths. "We need to keep moving." She wasn't fine, and everyone knew it. Her muscles were screaming with exhaustion, her lungs burned from the exertion, and her legs trembled with each step. But something deeper than physical strength was driving her forward. This was her chance to prove definitively that she belonged among combat soldiers, and she wasn't going to waste it. They reached the extraction point with minutes to spare, completing one of the most challenging individual carries that the instructors had witnessed during the training program. Harris, who had remained silent throughout the exercise, finally spoke as Maria carefully transferred her patient to the medical evacuation team. "Outstanding performance, Santos," he said simply. "That's exactly what we expect from our combat medics." The words carried weight that went far beyond simple praise. Harris was known for his sparing use of compliments, and his acknowledgement represented validation from one of the most respected instructors in the program. Word of Maria's performance spread quickly through the training company. The soldier who had been dismissed as too small for combat roles had just completed one of the most physically demanding tasks in the curriculum. Her success forced everyone, including herself, to reconsider assumptions about what she was capable of achieving. But even as her reputation among instructors and peers began to change, Maria understood that training exercises were still just simulations. The real test would come when she faced actual combat situations, where the stakes were genuine and failure could mean death rather than just poor evaluation scores. 6 months after completing advanced individual training, Maria found herself boarding a military transport aircraft bound for Afghanistan. The deployment represented everything she had trained for, but as she settled into her seat surrounded by seasoned soldiers, the reality of what lay ahead felt overwhelming. Alpha Company, 2nd Battalion was deploying to Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan, a region known for frequent Taliban activity and challenging terrain. The base supported various combat operations in the surrounding mountains, requiring frequent patrols and medical evacuation missions. Maria's introduction to combat medicine began before they even reached their destination. During a refueling stop in Germany, she encountered her first real casualties, soldiers from another unit who had been wounded in an improvised explosive device attack and were being evacuated for treatment. "Santos, get over here and assist," called Lieutenant Morrison, the senior medic who had been assigned as her mentor. "These soldiers need immediate attention." The wounded soldiers bore little resemblance to the training mannequins Maria had practiced on. Their injuries were real, messy, and complicated by infection and blood loss. One soldier had lost his left leg below the knee, while another suffered from severe burns across 40% of his body. Maria's medical training took over despite her nervousness. She started 4 lines, administered pain medication, and helped stabilize the patients for the flight to Germany. But the experience left her shaken in ways she hadn't anticipated. "It's different when it's real, isn't it?" observed Lieutenant Morrison as they watched the medical evacuation aircraft disappear into the night sky. "Training can prepare you for the technical aspects, but dealing with actual casualties requires something more." The observation proved prophetic when Alpha Company reached Afghanistan and began conducting regular patrols in the dangerous terrain surrounding their base. The mountains provided endless hiding places for insurgents, and improvised explosive devices were a constant threat along the primitive roads that connected remote villages. Maria's first month in country passed without major incident. She accompanied routine patrols, treated minor injuries and illnesses, and gradually adapted to the rhythm of deployment life. Her fellow soldiers remained somewhat protective of her, often assigning her to less dangerous positions during patrols. "Santos, you stay with the vehicles during this sweep," Sergeant Collins would instruct during typical patrol briefings. "We need someone to coordinate medical supplies and provide rear security." The assignments felt like training all over again, being relegated to support roles while the real soldiers handled the dangerous work. Maria understood that her squad leaders were trying to protect her, but she also felt like she wasn't contributing meaningfully to the unit's mission. The situation changed dramatically during a routine patrol in late October. Alpha Company was conducting a presence operation in a village suspected of harboring Taliban fighters. The mission seemed straightforward: establish security, search for weapons caches, and interact with local civilians to gather intelligence. Maria was assigned to the patrol's rear element, responsible for maintaining communication with the base and providing medical support if needed. She carried her standard load of medical supplies plus ammunition and communications equipment, a total weight that still challenged her small frame but had become manageable through months of conditioning. The patrol had been in the village for about 2 hours when everything went wrong simultaneously. The Taliban had prepared an ambush, positioning fighters in multiple buildings surrounding the village center. Their attack began with a coordinated barrage of rocket-propelled grenades followed by sustained automatic weapons fire from several directions. Contact front. Contact right. Contact everywhere, screamed Staff Sergeant Davis over the radio as Alpha Company found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. Maria's training kicked in immediately. She moved to a covered position behind a stone wall and began assessing the tactical situation while monitoring radio communications for casualty reports. The volume of enemy fire was intense, forcing the patrol to seek cover wherever they could find it. Medic! Medic! The call came from the village center, where two soldiers from the lead element had been caught in the initial rocket attack. One had been knocked unconscious by an explosion, while the other had taken shrapnel in his legs and was unable to move. The wounded soldiers were pinned down in an open area with no cover, approximately 50 meters from Maria's position. Enemy fire was concentrated on that section of the village, making movement extremely dangerous. The patrol's senior medic, Sergeant Johnson, was trapped with the rear security element on the opposite side of the village. Santos, can you reach those casualties? Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. Maria studied the terrain between her position and the wounded soldiers. The route required crossing two open areas where she would be completely exposed to enemy fire. Several other soldiers had already tried to reach the casualties and had been forced back by the intensity of the Taliban attack. I can try, Maria responded, knowing that every minute of delay increased the chances that the wounded soldiers would bleed to death. Negative, Santos, interrupted Sergeant Collins, who was coordinating the patrol's response from a covered position nearby. It's too dangerous. We'll figure out another way. But Maria could see that there was no other way. The casualties needed immediate medical attention, and she was the only medic in position to reach them. More importantly, she could see a route that larger soldiers might not be able to navigate, a series of low stone walls and drainage ditches that provided concealment for someone of her size. I'm going, Maria announced, already moving toward the casualties before anyone could stop her. The movement that followed would later be described by her fellow soldiers as one of the most courageous acts they had witnessed during their deployment. Maria used her small stature to navigate through spaces that provided minimal cover, moving quickly and quietly while enemy bullets snapped overhead. She reached the first casualty, Private Henderson, who was unconscious but breathing. A quick assessment revealed a probable concussion and various cuts from flying debris, but no immediately life-threatening injuries. The second soldier, Corporal Martinez, had taken multiple pieces of shrapnel in both legs and was losing blood rapidly. Martinez, stay with me, Maria called as she applied pressure dressings to the worst wounds. You're going to be fine, but I need you to help me get you both out of here. Working under fire while trying to treat two casualties simultaneously challenged every skill Maria had developed during her training. She needed to stop Martinez's bleeding while also monitoring Henderson's level of consciousness, all while remaining aware of the tactical situation around them. The Taliban fighters had identified her position and were directing concentrated fire at the casualties. Bullets struck the ground around them, sending up clouds of dust and debris that made visibility difficult. Maria found herself treating wounds while lying flat on the ground, using her body to shield the casualties from incoming fire. Santos, we're going to provide covering fire, Lieutenant Morrison announced over the radio. When you hear us open up, you need to move fast. The covering fire, when it came, was intense but brief. Maria had perhaps 30 seconds to move both casualties to better cover before the Taliban fighters could adjust their aim. Henderson was beginning to regain consciousness, which meant he could help with his own movement. But Martinez was weakening from blood loss. Maria made a split-second decision that would define her military career. Rather than attempting to move both soldiers simultaneously, she picked up Martinez in a fireman's carry and began moving toward cover. Her plan was to get him to safety first, then return for Henderson during the next covering fire sequence. Martinez weighed nearly 180 pounds plus his equipment, significantly more than Maria had ever carried during training exercises. But adrenaline and determination gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. She navigated the treacherous route while carrying the wounded soldier, moving with speed and agility that surprised even herself. Santos, what are you doing? Called Henderson, who had regained consciousness and was watching in disbelief as the diminutive medic carried his much larger teammate to safety. Getting you both home, Maria replied simply, already planning her return trip to collect Henderson. She managed to complete both evacuations during the firefight, moving each casualty to a secured position where they could receive more comprehensive medical treatment. Her actions allowed both soldiers to survive what could have been fatal wounds, but, more importantly, they demonstrated courage that earned the respect of every soldier in Alpha Company. The firefight continued for another hour before the Taliban fighters withdrew, leaving Alpha Company to assess the damage and evacuate their wounded. Maria's performance during the engagement became the talk of the forward operating base, with soldiers from other units seeking her out to hear the story firsthand. "Santos, I owe you my life," Martinez told her several days later as he prepared for medical evacuation to Germany. "When I saw you coming through that fire to get me, I couldn't believe someone your size was going to try to carry me out." "Size doesn't matter when your friends are in trouble," Maria replied, though she was still processing the intensity of what had happened during the firefight. The engagement marked a turning point in how her fellow soldiers viewed her capabilities. She was no longer the small soldier who needed protection during dangerous missions. Instead, she had become someone that others could depend on when situations became desperate. But Maria understood that combat was unpredictable, and one successful mission didn't guarantee future success. The Taliban were learning from each engagement, adapting their tactics, and becoming more dangerous over time. The real test of her abilities was still ahead, in situations that would demand even more than she had already given. 3 months into her deployment, Maria had established herself as one of the most reliable medics in Alpha Company. Her success during the village firefight had earned respect from soldiers who had initially doubted her capabilities, but she continued to face the daily challenge of proving herself in a role that many still considered unsuitable for someone of her size. The morning of January 15th began like any other day at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Alpha Company was preparing for a routine patrol to investigate reports of Taliban activity near a remote village in the mountains. Intelligence suggested that insurgents were using the area to store weapons and plan attacks on coalition forces. Maria was assigned to the patrol's lead element, a significant change from her usual position with the rear security team. Staff Sergeant Davis, who had initially been skeptical of her abilities, now trusted her enough to place her where casualties were most likely to occur. "Santos, you stay close to Lieutenant Morrison," Davis instructed during the pre-mission briefing. "If we hit anything out there, you two will be our primary medical response." The patrol consisted of 20 soldiers divided into 4 teams, each with specific responsibilities for security, communications, and intelligence gathering. Maria carried her standard medical kit plus additional supplies requested by the patrol leader, bringing her total equipment weight to nearly 70 pounds. The village was located 8 kilometers from the forward operating base, requiring a 2-hour movement through mountainous terrain that provided numerous opportunities for ambush. The patrol moved carefully, with scouts checking potential danger areas and communications teams maintaining contact with base. Everything seemed normal as they approached the village. Children played in the narrow streets while adults went about their daily routines. Local elders greeted the patrol respectfully, offering tea and expressing cooperation with the search for weapons caches. But the normalcy was deceptive. The Taliban had spent weeks preparing for this moment, positioning fighters throughout the village and surrounding mountains. Their plan was sophisticated, designed to trap the entire patrol in a killing zone from which escape would be nearly impossible. The attack began at 10:47 a.m. with a massive improvised explosive device that targeted the patrol's lead vehicle. The explosion was followed immediately by rocket-propelled grenades and automatic weapons fire from multiple directions. Within seconds, Alpha Company found itself under the most intense enemy fire any of them had experienced. "IED! IED! Vehicle down!" screamed the radio operator as debris rained down on the patrol. The lead vehicle had been completely destroyed, with its crew thrown clear by the force of the explosion. Maria was approximately 30 meters from the destroyed vehicle when the attack began. She could see that at least 3 soldiers were down and in need of immediate medical attention, but enemy fire was so intense that movement seemed impossible. Multiple casualties at the vehicle. Lieutenant Morrison called over the radio. "Santos, can you see the status?" Through the smoke and dust, Maria could identify 3 soldiers near the destroyed vehicle. 2 were moving and appeared to be attempting to reach cover, but the third was motionless and clearly in critical condition. She also noticed that several other soldiers had been wounded by shrapnel and were taking cover behind a stone wall about 50 meters away. The tactical situation was desperate. The patrol was pinned down by enemy fire from at least 6 different positions, making movement extremely dangerous. The wounded soldiers were scattered across an area that offered little cover, and traditional evacuation procedures were impossible under the circumstances. "Santos, stay where you are," ordered Staff Sergeant Davis over the radio. "It's too hot to move right now." But Maria could see that the motionless soldier near the destroyed vehicle was bleeding heavily and would likely die without immediate intervention. She studied the terrain and enemy fire patterns, looking for any opportunity to reach the casualties. What she noticed changed everything. The Taliban fighters were concentrating their fire on obvious routes between positions, assuming that the Americans would use conventional movement techniques. But Maria's small size offered possibilities that larger soldiers couldn't exploit. There was a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the main street, deep enough to provide concealment for someone of her stature, but too shallow for larger soldiers to use effectively. The ditch led directly to the area where the most seriously wounded soldier lay unconscious. "I can reach him," Maria announced over the radio, already moving toward the drainage ditch. "Negative, Santos." Davis responded immediately. "You stay put until we can establish covering fire." But Maria was already committed to her course of action. She low-crawled into the drainage ditch and began making her way toward the casualties. The movement was exhausting, requiring her to drag her medical kit and equipment through mud and debris while staying below the sight line of enemy fighters. The journey that should have taken 2 minutes under normal circumstances stretched to nearly 10 minutes as Maria navigated carefully through the ditch. Enemy bullets cracked overhead, occasionally striking the ground just above her position, but her route kept her concealed from direct observation. She reached the first casualty, Sergeant Williams, who was unconscious and had sustained massive trauma from the explosion. His pulse was weak, breathing was labored, and he was losing blood from multiple wounds. Maria immediately began emergency treatment while remaining in the relative safety of the ditch. Working in the confined space challenged every medical skill she had learned. She couldn't fully extend Williams' airway because of the space limitations, and applying pressure dressings required creative positioning to maintain effective treatment while staying concealed. "Santos, what's your status?" Morrison's voice crackled over her radio. "Williams is critical, but stable," Maria responded while continuing to work. "I need to get him to better cover for evacuation, but I can see 2 more casualties who need attention." The 2 other wounded soldiers were Private Johnson and Corporal Reed, both conscious but unable to move due to their injuries. Johnson had taken shrapnel in his back and was experiencing partial paralysis, while Reed had sustained a compound fracture of his left leg that was bleeding severely. Maria faced an impossible decision. She could attempt to evacuate Williams immediately, potentially saving his life, but leaving the other 2 casualties without medical attention. Or she could treat all 3 soldiers in their current positions, risking that Williams might not survive the delay. She chose a third option that no one expected. Rather than evacuating the casualties individually, she decided to move all 3 soldiers to a more secure position where she could provide comprehensive treatment while the patrol established a defensive perimeter. The plan required her to carry Williams first, then return for Johnson and Reed. But Williams weighed over 200 pounds, significantly more than she had ever attempted to carry, even during her legendary performance in training. And she would need to make the carries while under enemy fire across terrain that offered minimal cover. "Santos, you're insane if you think you can carry Williams," Johnson called out weakly from his position nearby. "He's twice your size." "Then I'll have to be twice as strong," Maria replied, positioning herself to lift the unconscious sergeant. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most extraordinary displays of courage and determination they had ever witnessed. Maria lifted Williams into a fireman's carry, her small frame straining under his weight, and began moving toward better cover. The carry should have been impossible. Williams, fully equipped, weighed more than twice what Maria weighed. But desperation, adrenaline, and months of conditioning gave her strength that defied logic. She moved steadily across the dangerous terrain, never losing her footing despite the enormous burden. Enemy fighters noticed her movement and began concentrating fire on her position. Bullets struck the ground around them, but Maria continued moving with determination that bordered on the superhuman. Her fellow soldiers provided covering fire when possible, but much of the journey she completed under direct enemy observation. "I don't believe what I'm seeing," breathed Lieutenant Morrison as he watched through binoculars from his covered position. "There's no way someone her size should be able to carry Williams that distance." Maria reached the covered position and carefully placed Williams where other soldiers could continue his treatment. Without pausing to rest, she immediately began planning her return trip to collect Johnson. "Santos, you need to rest," insisted Corporal Martinez, who had been wounded himself but was still conscious. "You're exhausting yourself." "Johnson and Reed are still out there," Maria replied simply. "I'm going back." The second carry proved even more challenging than the first. Johnson was conscious and in severe pain, making him difficult to position for transport. His back injury also meant that improper handling could cause permanent paralysis. Maria solved the problem by modifying her carrying technique, supporting Johnson in a way that protected his spine while still allowing her to navigate the treacherous terrain. The carry was slower than her first trip, but she maintained the same steady determination despite her obvious fatigue. By the time she completed the second evacuation, Taliban fire was beginning to decrease as coalition air support arrived in the area. But Maria still needed to return for Reed, who was the least seriously wounded but couldn't move independently due to his leg injury. The third carry broke every assumption about human physical limitations that the soldiers of Alpha Company had held. Maria was clearly exhausted, having already carried 2 soldiers who significantly outweighed her across dangerous terrain under enemy fire. But she picked up Reed without hesitation and completed the final evacuation with the same steady determination she had shown throughout the engagement. When medical evacuation helicopters finally arrived, all 3 casualties were stable and ready for transport. Maria had not only saved their lives, but had done so under conditions that would have challenged soldiers twice her size and strength. "Santos, I don't understand how you did what you just did," Staff Sergeant Davis said as they watched the medical evacuation aircraft disappear into the distance. "That was physically impossible." Maria was sitting against a stone wall, finally, allowing herself to rest after hours of continuous exertion. Her uniform was torn and bloody, her hands were scraped and battered, and she was clearly exhausted. But her expression showed satisfaction rather than pride. "When people are depending on you, impossible becomes possible," she replied quietly. Word of Maria's performance spread rapidly throughout the military community in Afghanistan. The story of the tiny medic who had carried 3 soldiers to safety under enemy fire became legendary, earning her commendations and recognition from commanders throughout the region. More importantly, Maria had definitively proven that courage and determination could overcome any physical limitation. The soldier who had been told she was too weak for combat had just completed one of the most heroic actions of the entire deployment. But for Maria, the recognition mattered less than the knowledge that she had saved her friends' lives. She had found her place among warriors not by becoming bigger or stronger, but by refusing to accept that her size defined her capabilities. The girl who had enlisted to help her family had evolved into a soldier whose actions would inspire others for years to come. She had proven that true strength came not from physical attributes, but from an unwillingness to abandon those who depended on her courage.